Kicked out mother accidentally becomes rich after her husband left her with nothing. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The sun sets slowly over the city skyline, casting a hazy glow through the blinds in the small, lifeless apartment Sarah now called home. Her body ached from a long day of standing at the register at the grocery store, her mind spinning with fatigue as she glanced at the pile of bills on the table. She could barely scrape by on the paycheck she received, which seemed to dwindle faster each week. In the silence, the words of her ex-husband, Eric, echoed in her mind, words she hadn't been able to shake since he'd left her. "You'll never make it without me. You're just too soft, too soft." The words stung even now, months after he'd left, taking everything of value with him, leaving her with only a battered couch, a mattress on the floor, and an empty bank account. Their life together had vanished in an instant, and with it, the woman Sarah thought she'd become. Eric had been the kind of man who seemed to thrive on belittling others, all charm and control when he wanted something, cold and calculated when he didn't. She could still see his smirk as he handed her the divorce papers, the flicker of satisfaction when he told her the house and the savings account were in his name alone. All these years, she'd been a ghost in her own life, trapped in his shadow without realizing it. But that was before. In the months since, she'd worked every shift she could find, taking odd jobs and cutting costs in ways she never imagined she'd have to. Her world had shrunk to a dim, exhausted routine, but she had refused to break under the weight. She still had her pride, and somehow, that was enough to keep her going. One evening, after yet another grueling shift, she was sorting through a cardboard box of her father's old belongings, the only thing she'd been able to bring with her from their former home. Her father had passed away years ago, and she hadn't looked at the box in ages. But tonight, desperate to clear her mind, she decided to sift through its contents. Inside were stacks of papers, letters, and a few faded photos of her parents from a time she'd barely remembered. But at the bottom of the box, tucked away in a small, worn-out envelope, was a document she didn't recognize. Curious, she pulled it out, unfolding the brittle paper with care. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words. Investment certificate. It was dated nearly 2 decades earlier and bore her father's name, along with a modest sum he'd invested in a tech startup she'd never heard of. The name on the certificate was Phoenix Tech, a small company that, according to the document, he had invested a few $1,000s in as a hopeful gamble. He must have tucked it away and forgotten about it. She wondered for a moment if it was even worth anything anymore. The next day, she decided to check, almost expecting to find that the company had gone bankrupt years ago. After all, a $1,000 investment 2 decades ago couldn't amount to much, could it? But as she researched the name, her jaw dropped. Phoenix Tech had become a multi-billion-dollar company, a household name in technology, innovation, and artificial intelligence. The investment was no longer just a few $1,000s. It was a small fortune. The sum stared back at her on the screen, almost mocking her disbelief. She rubbed her eyes, certain she must be dreaming. It was real, there in black and white, an unimaginable amount that could change everything. But then, doubt crept in. Was it truly hers to claim? Her father's signature was on the document, but he had passed the inheritance on to her, and she had no siblings to contest it. The lawyers confirmed it. The fortune was legally hers. For the first time since her world had crumbled, a spark of hope flickered in her chest. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry, so she did both, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched the document in trembling hands. All this time, she'd been struggling to survive, never imagining that a hidden piece of her family's history could save her from despair. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life began to transform in ways she had only dreamed. She moved out of the cramped apartment and bought a modest, comfortable home in a safe neighborhood where her young daughter, Lily, could play outside. She went from counting pennies to having the freedom to dream, to breathe, to plan a future she thought she'd lost. She invested a portion of the money wisely, following the advice of financial advisors who assured her that she was now part of a select few who could live comfortably without worry. She donated to charities for single mothers, creating programs that helped women like herself rise out of desperate situations. Her story became an inspiration for many in her community, though she kept her newfound wealth private, living quietly and staying grounded, careful not to flaunt her fortune. And just as she finally felt at peace, as she began to build a new life of meaning and purpose, there was a knock at her door. The knock reverberated through her new home, breaking the serene quiet of the evening. Sarah hadn't been expecting anyone, especially this late. She paused, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, her heart fluttering with a mix of curiosity and unease. Her world felt fragile, a delicate balance she'd only just managed to find, and the last thing she wanted was anything that might disrupt it. She opened the door cautiously, and there he stood, Eric. He looked almost ghostly, like a specter of her past, and for a moment, she felt as though she was back in that cramped apartment, exhausted and desperate. But the reality now was different. She was different. Eric's once sharp appearance had dulled. His suit was worn, his face tired and etched with new lines of worry she'd never seen before. There was no charming smile, no arrogance in his posture. If anything, he looked smaller, humbled. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know where else to go." She took a step back, instinctively folding her arms over her chest. Memories flooded her mind. The humiliation, the feeling of being discarded like she was nothing more than a stepping stone on his way to bigger things. She knew he could see the change in her. She was no longer the timid, fearful wife he had once dismissed. "What are you doing here, Eric?" Her voice was steady, colder than she intended, but it matched the steel in her heart. He glanced around, as if the walls of her home could somehow provide him with the answers he needed. "I heard about everything. The money, your new place. I didn't realize things had turned around for you." His words were almost stammered, a far cry from the confidence he once wielded like a weapon. Sarah couldn't help but let a small, bitter smile touch her lips. "I'm sure you didn't. You never bothered to look back, Eric." He lowered his gaze, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was wrong, okay? I made a mistake. I thought you'd be better off without me. Is that why you left me with nothing?" Her words were sharp, piercing the silence between them. She watched as he struggled to find an excuse, some way to justify his actions. But the truth was written on his face. He knew there was no excuse. He had left her because he thought she was weak, unworthy, a burden he could cast aside to pursue his ambitions. I was going through things," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't easy for me either. But I came here because things have changed, Sarah. I'm in trouble. Financially. She'd known deep down from the moment he showed up, but hearing him say confirmed everything. He wasn't here out of regret or guilt. He was here because he needed her. "I lost everything," he continued, his tone growing more desperate as he saw her expression harden. "The business, it didn't survive. I thought I could handle it, but it all came crashing down. I've been trying to make ends meet, but it's impossible. And now I'm practically bankrupt." The words hung in the air, heavy with irony. She wanted to feel sympathy, to pity him, but all she could think about was the months she had spent clawing her way out of the pit he'd left her in, how she'd found her own way without his help, and now, here he was begging for a lifeline. "So, let me get this straight," she said, her tone laced with disbelief. "You threw me away when you thought I was worthless, but now that I have something, you come crawling back." He winced at her words, but desperation overtook whatever pride he had left. "I know I don't deserve your help, Sarah. I know that, but I'm begging you, please. I'm on the edge of losing everything." She watched him for a long, silent moment, weighing the emotions swirling in her heart. Part of her wanted to turn him away, to give him a taste of the desolation he had so carelessly thrown her into. But a small, nagging part of her remembered the years they had spent together, the moments when they had loved each other, or at least when she had believed they did. Taking a deep breath, she gestured for him to sit. He sank into the armchair in the living room, looking out of place in her new life. She sat across from him, studying his haggard face, noticing for the first time how hollow his eyes had become. "Eric," she began slowly, "I built this life on my own. Every cent I have now came from something I found after you left me. My father left me an investment I didn't even know about. and that's what changed everything. You had nothing to do with it." He swallowed hard, his face crumpling with regret. "I know that, Sarah, and I'm grateful you managed to make something of yourself. But please, I need your help. I'm not asking for much, just enough to get back on my feet." She looked at him, her mind racing. After all he'd done, he had the audacity to come to her for help, and yet something inside her softened. A small, battered part of her heart that still remembered the man she once loved, or the man she thought he was. "Eric, I can't give you money," she said, her voice firm. "But I can tell you this. The person I was when you left me, she's gone. I don't owe you anything anymore. I fought for every bit of this life, and I won't let you drag me back into your problems." He looked at her, speechless, the reality of her words settling in. She could see the desperation flicker in his eyes, but he nodded slowly, understanding that he had no right to ask for anything from her. As he stood to leave, he muttered a hollow "thank you," the words empty and meaningless. And just as he reached the door, he turned back, one last look of pleading in his eyes. "Sarah, if you ever change your mind," but she had already closed the door on him. For the first time, she felt truly free. The days passed quietly after Eric's visit, a strange sense of calm settling over Sarah. She hadn't realized how much of her life had been shadowed by the fear that he might return, that he would somehow pull her back into the chaos she had finally left behind. But now, with her door firmly closed to him, she felt a peace she hadn't known before. She poured her energy into her new life, focusing on her daughter, Lily, and the foundation she had set up to support single mothers. Each day brought new stories of resilience and survival from the women she was helping, women who, like her, had been left with nothing but had found the strength to rebuild. Sarah often thought about the improbable path that had led her here. The hidden investment from her father had been nothing short of a miracle, a lifeline she never could have anticipated. In a way, it felt as though her father had reached out from the past to protect her, to offer her a second chance when she needed it most. And with that gift, she had managed to build a future not just for herself, but for her daughter and the many women who looked up to her. But the peace didn't last. One morning, she received a call from her lawyer, a note of urgency in his voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said. "It's about Eric." Her pulse quickened as she clutched the phone tighter. "What's going on?" "It appears that he's filed a lawsuit against you," her lawyer continued. "He's claiming that as your former spouse, he's entitled to a portion of the investment's value. He's arguing that the investment certificate qualifies as marital property and therefore should be split." Sarah felt a cold wave of anger rise within her, mingling with disbelief. The audacity. She had thought he would disappear after their last encounter, that he would finally understand he had no claim on her life or her success. But instead, he was back, and he was ready to fight. "Can he really do this?" she asked, her voice trembling with frustration. "There's a chance he could complicate things," her lawyer admitted. "Marital property laws can be tricky, especially in cases where there's no clear prenuptial agreement. He's going to argue that the investment's value accrued during your marriage, and therefore he's entitled to a share." For a moment, Sarah felt a wave of despair. After everything she had endured, was he really going to drag her through another battle? She had fought so hard to build this life, and the thought of him dismantling it, piece by piece, was almost too much to bear. But then, as she took a deep breath, a new resolve settled over her. No, she had come too far to let him take any part of this from her. She was no longer the frightened woman he'd left behind. She was stronger, wiser, and she knew she would fight him with everything she had. Her lawyer assured her he would prepare for the worst, building a case to counter Eric's claims. And as the weeks passed, Sarah steeled herself for the impending legal battle. She attended every meeting, reviewed every document, and made sure she understood every step of the process. She was determined to be involved, to face Eric head-on, this time as an equal, not a victim. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. Sarah walked into the courthouse, her head held high, dressed simply but elegantly. She saw Eric seated across the room, his face drawn and pale, a shadow of the man she had once known. He barely met her gaze, and she could see the tension in his clenched fists, the nervous tapping of his foot. Whatever confidence he had once exuded had long faded, replaced by a hollow desperation. The case was presented, and Eric's lawyer argued passionately, claiming that the investment was marital property and should be split. But Sarah's lawyer was equally prepared, countering every point with precision, reminding the court that the investment had been untouched and forgotten, that it was an inheritance from her father and not something Eric had any hand in. Sarah sat quietly, watching the proceedings, feeling a strange sense of detachment. This wasn't her life on trial. It was her past, and she was ready to leave it behind once and for all. Finally, the judge turned to deliver his ruling. Sarah held her breath, every muscle tense, her hands clasped tightly together. After reviewing all evidence presented, the judge began, "It is clear that the investment was indeed a gift from the plaintiff's father, one that was intended solely for her benefit. The defendant's claim to any portion of the investment is unfounded." A wave of relief washed over Sarah as she exhaled, tears stinging her eyes. She had won. She was free. Eric had no claim on her, no hold over her future, and for the first time, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. As the court adjourned, she watched Eric slump in his seat, defeated. He looked up at her, his face etched with bitterness and regret, and for a fleeting moment, she almost pitied him. Almost. But she reminded herself that he had made his choice long ago. She had given him everything, and he had thrown it away. Now, she had nothing left to give. She left the courthouse, stepping into the sunlight with a renewed sense of purpose. The world felt brighter, the air fresher, and as she walked away, she felt like a new woman, a woman who had reclaimed her life, who had triumphed over the past. In the following months, Sarah poured herself into her work, her foundation growing beyond her wildest dreams. Her story had inspired others, drawing attention to her cause, and with each passing day, she found fulfillment in helping others rise from the hardships she had once known. One evening, as she tucked Lily in a bed, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had gone from a woman abandoned and broken to someone who could stand tall, someone her daughter could look up to with pride. And as she closed her eyes that night, Sarah knew that she had truly found the life she deserved, not through wealth, but through resilience, through the strength to move forward, and the courage to build a future that no one could ever take away from her. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.